This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're diving into the big edition of the offseason, Chris Tanev, on the opening day of training camp. It's finally here. Preseason starts this weekend. Training camp is here. We have all of the players reporting to camp. We have the new height weights. We have some quotes from GM, head coach, players, all of it. It's finally here, but Camp Countdown continues on right up until the start of the brand new season. Today we're diving into Chris Tanev, obviously the biggest offseason addition for this Maple Leafs team. It's a player that the team had coveted for a while over the course of the season, a player that GM Brad Treliving signed back in Calgary, a player that he tried to acquire before the trade deadline. Ultimately, he was moved to the Dallas Stars instead of the Maple Leafs. There was some weird stuff about whether the Flames would trade him to the Maple Leafs or wanting more from the Maple Leafs than what they would accept from other teams because of the weird dynamic of Treliving leaving. Whatever it may be, that's in the rearview mirror. He's with the Maple Leafs now, and that's the big thing. On a 6-year contract at $4.5 million per season. It's a big ticket. Not necessarily for each individual season. The cap hit is more than reasonable for a player of what Chris Tanev brings to the table right now. It's more about how that contract will age. He's 34 years old. He'll be 35 mid-season. And looking at somebody just with the Maple Leafs, for example, as a Mark Giordano, we just finished Mark Giordano's age 40 season. He's still a free agent. He wasn't in the playoff lineup. He wasn't even a thought of being in the playoff lineup. And of course, he got banged up at the end of the season. Didn't help his case at all, but nobody really ever thought that Giordano was going to be a piece on the playoff lineup for the Maple Leafs. And that was his age 40 season, which would be the equivalent of the last season of this upcoming Chris Tanev deal. So the Leafs are very much making a play for the early part of that contract rather than, of course, the late stages of that contract. And maybe there's a chance that that ends up on long-term injured reserve or whatever ends up being the case. I don't think that you can really project that because we just simply don't know how that's going to play out, even if the rules and weird CBA stuff might even change by that point. We don't really know. What we can evaluate is what Chris Tanev brings to the table now, and that is an elite defensive defenseman. He ranks among the league's best in puck battles won. He ranks around the league's best in puck recoveries. He ranks among the league best in shot blocks. And he does all of that while playing this very cerebral, defensive-minded game. He's not a defenseman that's going to put up the offensive points by any means. He's coming off of a season where he scored less than 20 points. But that's not why he's being brought to the Maple Leafs. He's being brought to the Maple Leafs for that defensive game. And it's a defensive game that, with his quality, matches unbelievably well with the top four on this Maple Leafs roster. Whether that's playing with Morgan Rielly or whether that's playing with Jake McCabe, no matter which pairing he ends up with, Chris Tanev is an elite defensive defenseman that is a massive addition to this Maple Leafs roster. And if you're talking about the prototypical, if you're talking about the type of defenseman and that ticks all of the boxes that you want to add to this Maple Leafs roster over the past 5, 6, 7 years, it is Chris Tanev. He ticks all of the boxes. An absolute warrior on the penalty kill. As I mentioned, among the league's best in puck battles won, puck recoveries, moving the puck from the defensive zone and quickly turning that into offense back the other direction by starting the breakout, by getting the puck out cleanly. That's going to help the forwards and such on this roster as well, and especially come playoff time where it seems so often that the Maple Leafs struggle to create off of the rush, create those consistent chances. Chris Tanev's breakout ability and defensive ability to recover the puck and turn that back the other direction will help this team in other areas other than just purely defense. And that makes him one of the biggest additions to this Maple Leafs roster in recent memory. You go past the past handful of years and the Leafs have made certain moves that have been intriguing on the surface, have maybe been for a bigger ticket than the $4.5 million cap hit that Chris Tanev is at. But in terms of a player that the Leafs need that is made for playoff success, Chris Tanev is that player. You look over the Leafs' history in the playoffs, and specifically talking about Morgan Rielly here, the players that he has primarily played with in every single playoff run or series for the most part, because let's be honest, there hasn't really been much running that the Leafs have done in the playoffs. Last year, his most common partner was Ilya Lyubushkin. Won those minutes 4-1, 51% Corsi 4. Lyubushkin was a perfectly fine partner for Morgan Rielly, but had to be sheltered in certain situations and couldn't be trusted the way that Chris Tanev can be trusted to play all of those minutes with somebody like Morgan Rielly at the top of a lineup and also anchor a penalty kill at the same time. Luke Schenn, I think if you look over most of the history, people would agree is kind of the defenseman that made the biggest impact alongside Morgan Rielly. He ticked a lot of similar boxes to Chris Tanev, just kind of a lesser version of Tanev with less mobility and kind of more of the physical side than Chris Tanev. Was an even 50% pretty much exactly in terms of shot share, but won his minutes 92 in that 2023 run. That was probably the best that we've seen out of any of the defense pairings over the course of like a full series, and then of course into that second round series for a Morgan Rielly defense partner. And that's what made the loss of Luke Schenn that summer sting a little bit more. 2022, hey, guess who's back? Ilya Lyubushkin. The first time around in that Lightning series, it did not go very well. 46% shot share, lost those minutes 3-4. It's one of the few times in Rielly's playoff history that he's actually lost his 5-on-5 minutes in terms of the goal battle. In 2021, this is a key one that I want to get to. He was paired with TJ Brodie, and this is the first season that TJ Brodie was with this Maple Leafs team. A lot of conversation since Tanev has arrived has been that he's the best partner in Morgan Rielly's career. And I ultimately think that will end up being true because of the right shot and all the boxes that he ticks. But let's also give TJ Brodie his flowers. Yes, it did not end well last season. He became a below average defenseman in terms of the defensive ability, couldn't hang at the top of a lineup anymore, and was ultimately out of the lineup basically for the entire series against the Bruins this year. It was a pretty dramatic fall off from what we've seen in previous years. And so let's not forget those previous years as well. In 2020-21, when TJ Brodie arrived, he was superb on that top pairing on the right side alongside Morgan Rielly. In that playoff series, the only playoff series where those two primarily played together, 58% shot share and won the minutes 2-0 in that 2021 series. That was a very strong pairing that ultimately led to TJ Brodie in the rest of his Leafs career being in more of that kind of pure shutdown role in the playoffs rather than being paired with Morgan Rielly. It seemed like the Leafs were trying to find a stopgap on that top pairing and give TJ Brodie, whether it be with Jake Muzzin or later with Jake McCabe, that kind of pure shutdown pairing that never quite worked in the same way. But those early couple of seasons for TJ Brodie alongside Morgan Rielly should not be overrated it shouldn't be underrated because TJ Brodie in those first couple seasons was very, very good defensively, playing on his offside and giving Morgan Rielly the ability to do what he does best, and that's play offense. So as we appreciate what Chris Tanev does this season and appreciate him being the best probably defense partner that Morgan Rielly's ever had, let's give TJ Brodie some flowers as well for what he did early in his Leafs tenure. You go before TJ Brodie and it was an absolute gong show, to put it lightly. In 2020, Cody Ceci, that experiment, Ceci had some fine numbers at times that season, but in the playoffs was not good. 46% shot share against Columbus, lost the minutes 0-2. The Leafs didn't score with those two on the ice. Not a good series for Rielly and that CC pairing. Before that, it was Ron Hainsey in 2019 and 2018. In fact, over this current Leafs era, it's the only time that Rielly has primarily played with the same defense partner in back-to-back seasons, and it did not go that well either. The Leafs did win those minutes 5-2 in 2019 and 5-4 in 2018, but the Leafs were heavily outplayed in those minutes. And then in 2017, the Leafs' first foray into the playoffs, and I honestly couldn't believe this. I completely forgot that Matt Honwick was the guy playing with Morgan Rielly that year and lost those minutes 2-3. So all of that to be said is Chris Tanev is a massive upgrade over significant amount of those defensemen. Pretty much the only time that you could compare somebody was TJ Brodie, and then the Luke Schenn chemistry just kind of worked. And that's what makes this addition so exciting, because if Luke Schenn in those minutes could put up the results that Rielly and him did in those couple of playoff series, what can it be like with Chris Tanev there, who is an pretty much every single facet, except for the physical game, better than Luke Shen, is really, really exciting. The eye test is there for Chris Tanev, obviously, but also the analytics. Over the past 3 seasons, he's the best defenseman in the NHL in defensive goals above replacement, and it's not particularly close at the top of that list as well. Whether you look at microstats as well, Tanev being in the top 2, top 3, top 5, and things like puck battles won, puck recoveries, turning defense into offense is what he's done so well for his entire career and limiting teams from getting to the middle of the ice as well. And so let's look at the numbers from Chris Tanev in the playoffs last season. Won his minutes at 5-on-5 against Jack Eichel and the Golden Knights 3-0 in 46-34 matched up against Jack Eichel. Didn't even allow that Eichel unit to score a goal while he was on the ice. In the second round against Nathan MacKinnon at 5-on-5, played 68-43 against Nate and won those minutes 3-1 head-to-head. There are not a lot of defensive defensemen in the league that can handle the speed and power game of those two centers, and Chris Tanev was able to do it in the playoffs in back-to-back series in very tough dogfight series against the Golden Knights and Avalanche. Things weren't as rosy in the third round against Connor McDavid, of course. Lost those minutes 3-4 head-to-head and just shy of 50 minutes, but overall, a very, very strong playoffs from Chris Tanev. Considering how well he played in the playoffs this past spring, and he's arriving on this Leafs team now, and he will get to play with that Leafs team the entire year, and you'll be able to figure out what works and what doesn't, and what pairings you like going into the playoffs, and you can gain chemistry over the course of the season rather than just a couple months sprint right into the playoffs like it was for Dallas last year. It's extremely, extremely exciting, the prospect of Chris Tanev in this Maple Leafs lineup in the playoffs. He has the legitimate shutdown ability against the elite stars in the game to win those matchups head to head and see what the Leafs can do, not even just in the depth of the lineup, but win the minutes at the top of the lineup when so much of the discussion has been kind of breaking even in those big minutes against the star players and then seeing what kind of the rest of the lineup has done. His ability to get the puck in his defensive zone, get it back up the ice, and transition up the ice is so impressive. That's what's made him such an elite defensive player, kind of generally speaking, in addition to the penalty killing and kind of shot blocking. It's that factor that really excites me because, yeah, obviously an elite defensive defenseman is going to help in the playoffs. That's straightforward. But for me, looking at the Leafs struggles and the struggles to score in the playoffs, I think some of it comes back to the lack of puck moving ability on the defense. When you have guys like Lyubushkin, Shen, Joel Edmondson this year in the playoff lineup, guys that sure they can defend well and aren't going to allow as many great chances in close. I'll give the Leafs and those players that. But when the puck is on their stick, moving the puck back up the ice, transitioning from those defensive situations to offensive situations, it's just not good enough from those players. And we've kind of seen that time and time again in the playoffs. With somebody like Chris Tanev, that is not an issue in his game. He's very good at breaking the puck out and can play off of Morgan Riley if that is his partner. Most likely will be his partner. They can play off of each other in that way as well. And so if the Leafs in those big minutes with guys like Matthews, Marner, Nylander, Tavares on the ice aren't struggling to get the puck and break it back up the ice and kind of have to do it themselves, and have another option to break the puck out and get it up to them, maybe in the neutral zone, rather than them needing to come all the way deep into the defensive zone and carry it up all the way and try and break through defenses themselves. It's going to allow the Leafs to attack quicker in the playoffs. It's going to allow the Leafs to attack more consistently off the rush as well in the playoffs. And I think those factors are some of the key things that are underrated in this Chris Tanev edition that are going to help the Leafs come playoff time as well. I am very excited to see what Chris Tanev can do in this Leafs lineup. You're going to hear a lot of that in my upcoming conversation with Nick DeSouza. And so it's, for me, well worth the 6-year risk. Yes, this contract isn't going to look good in years probably 4, 5, 6. But this Leafs team needs to break through now. And Chris Tanev, among all the defensemen that were available this summer, is the player that helps them do that most. Yes, he's going to be 35 midseason. Yes, he is a lot of wear and tear on that body. But if the Leafs manage it well, He's shown an ability to play games consistently the past 3 seasons and be available consistently in the playoffs as well. I just think this is a home run play for the Maple Leafs. Yes, there is risk in that contract. Yes, I would much prefer if it was a 3-year deal for a $4.5 million cap hit. That just wasn't realistic. You're getting an elite defensive defenseman player for less than what he should be on the open market. He should be getting $5-6+ million on a shorter term contract, but you went longer to get him on a cheaper contract to allow you to do some other things on the roster. Now it's time to make good on what that allows you to do on that roster this season. Instead of going into the trade deadline, needing to get the Ilya Lyubushkins, the Luke Schens, those kind of additions, Joel Edmondsons, you have it from day one and a much better version of that as well. The Leafs can spend their assets in different ways, maybe addressing a bigger need at forward that they didn't necessarily do in the past, or spend less of those kind of secondary assets on trying to fill holes on defense and just keep those and build a deeper, better prospect pool that can also help you in the future acquire better players as well and have more ammo going into deadlines in the future. There's a lot of different ways to look at this Chris Tanev signing, but all of them come back to it being an extreme positive for the Maple Leafs. And so I'm very excited now to get to my conversation with Nick DeSouza as we dive even deeper into Chris Tanev's game, the pros of him coming into this lineup, the riskiness of the long-term contract, and if we could potentially see Chris Tanev with a defenseman other than Morgan Rielly as well. Let's get to that conversation now. Very excited to welcome onto the show Nick DeSouza to talk all about Chris Tanev. Nick, thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. I've been really enjoying this series, so I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thanks, man. Appreciate the kind words. And so I think one that I think a lot of people are looking forward to, both in terms of the series and also to see it actually on the ice, is Chris Tanev. Why was he the guy that you wanted to chat about today?
Well, I think with Tanev, obviously it's the Leafs' most kind of prominent ad this summer. Probably one of the best defensemen, if not the best defenseman that they've added over the last 5-6 years. Definitely the best right-handed defenseman that they've added in I don't know, a long time. I can't, I'm not going to go through the list either, but yeah, just definitely it's an interesting kind of way that they got him. We'll definitely go kind of dive into that, but there's kind of a lot of talking points. I think obviously we're going to get into the pros of how good of a player Tanev actually is. I think it's pretty well documented the long-term kind of cons or concerns that are there with getting a player that's 34 years old on a 6-year contract, but also some short-term things that, kind of cons or concerns that the Leafs need to look into, particularly with usage and just minutes in general. So I know we're going to dive into all of that. So that's why I picked Tanev. I think it's he's kind of an exciting player to kind of think of. Definitely one of the mysteries going into the year and really a positive mystery.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating ad because if you talk about what you want to add to this Maple Leafs team for the past 4, 5, 6 years with this kind of new era in the Matthews era, it is basically everything that Chris Tanev brings to the table in terms of being that warrior, a right shot defenseman, penalty killer, literally one of the best defensive defensemen in the league. He ticks all the boxes that the Leafs have been looking for in that kind of defenseman, except for the fact that he's going to be 35 next season and they signed him to a 6-year contract. So we'll get into all of that in a little bit. I want to start off with Chris Tanev, the player, before getting into the contract and such, and why he's such a strong fit for the Maple Leafs. Whether it's the eye test, analytics, whatever you look at, Chris Tanev ranks as one of the best defensive defensemen in the league. He literally leads all defensemen in defensive goals above replacement by evolving hockey over the past 3 seasons. He was elite in the playoffs in a lot of metrics. What is it that makes everyone so excited about the Chris Tanev defensive game added to this Maple Leafs roster?
I think first and foremost, you kind of hit it on the head there. When you talk about analytics, when you talk about the eye test, even people that are watching at home, kind of like your casual fan that's watching hockey in a one viewing, they're watching it live. After the game, they maybe watch highlights, they go to bed. They're also going to kind of really appreciate what Chris Tanev brings to the table. And that, especially with defensive defensemen, I find that that's very rare. Sometimes you'll get defensemen that are very, very quiet. They do things like stopping zone entries, making a good first pass, stopping pucks in the neutral zone. Those are a little bit more difficult to kind of notice in real time, especially in the playoffs or very kind of high emotion games. Then you have those defensemen that, they hit, they are fighting, they're scoring, they're putting up points, they have big hits. Those are the ones that are kind of more noticeable. Tanev kind of does it all. He stops pucks in the neutral zone. He's very good at defending his line. He's very strong along the boards. He can clear the front of the net. He's got a good first pass. So, he blocks shots, which is really nice to watch. So, and as a result, all those things that he does, whether it's quiet, whether it's very noticeable, it shows up in the metrics. You kind of talked earlier about goals above replacement. Even when you look at how good he is within his cohort of defensive defensemen, even last year, only 67 defensemen of last season had under 45% of offensive zone starts. So just a ton of D zone starts. And only 67 defensemen that were in under 45% in offensive zone starts who played at least 200 minutes at 5-on-5. Tanev ranked second in terms of expected goals for at 5-on-5. The only one who beat him was Issa Lendl, who he played with in Dallas. So they were a very strong pairing as a shutdown pairing. So like this is a very, very good player.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned kind of the way that he goes about it because I think the people that haven't really seen too much of Chris Tanev, and he's played a lot of his career in Calgary, in Vancouver, on kind of the Western Conference team. So maybe some more casual fans might not be as familiar with kind of the style. They hear the defensive defenseman and maybe expect a big hitter and some of those elements you talked about. That's not the Chris Tanev game. He had 45 hits last year. That's less than Mitch Marner, Timothy Liljegren, Pontus Holmberg. Like, he is not kind of that defensive defenseman big hitter that you expect when you see the 207 blocks, which would have led the Leafs by 48. The other guys that had 200 plus blocks in the NHL last year all had well over 100 hits. So he's very unique in that regard among the defensive defensemen in the league in being that cerebral defensive player that doesn't really do it by laying the body as much. And maybe that's something that some fans might hope to see and aren't going to get. But I think, as you said there, they will appreciate the defensive game because even though the subtleties of the game are really what make Chris Tanev such an elite defensive player, he does it so well in the puck recoveries and the puck battles. He does it so often as well that I think people will appreciate the defensive game, especially given how much of a need it has been over the years with this Maple Leafs roster, having that revolving door of the big kind of right shot defensemen who don't do things nearly as good as Chris Tanev has.
100%. And I think, obviously it's been very well documented in Toronto that, every year we're looking for that right shot defenseman that's top four, that can play big minutes, that can go against the top pair. It is kind of a league-wide issue, right? Like finding these defensive defensemen that, that have that right shot. So getting Chris Tanev is, in the window where the Leafs are looking to win. It's definitely a plus, and he's definitely going to help this team next year. So I like the ad overall, and then just because of how good of a player is and the cap hit, obviously they took a bit of a discount. Tanev took a bit of a discount because of the term that he got, but at 4.5, I mean, you can't really complain in terms of just year-to-year value that you're getting, depending on how he kind of ages out as he gets older.
Absolutely. Like, yeah, we'll get to it in a second, but some of the other defensemen on that right side that signed this year, that signed for more than Tanev is kind of crazy to look at in terms of the difference in value. Looking at this Maple Leafs roster, most people have Chris Tanev penciled in alongside Morgan Rielly. And I think that's probably the right choice. I think that's ultimately what it will likely end up being, at least to start the season, just because Rielly has had so many different defense partners over recent years, whether it be Ilya Lyubushkin a couple of times, Luke Shen, TJ Brody when he was good and then not so good. There's been a lot of different mixes for Morgan Rielly at the top of that lineup, and Chris Tanev is just that natural fit in terms of being that defensive guy alongside Rielly and also being strong enough to move the puck and help him in the rush game as well. There's also the option of playing him with Jake McCabe and having that kind of quintessential complete shutdown pairing, kind of similar to what we saw last season in Dallas with Essa Lindell. Which of the two ideas do you prefer, and which do you think we'll ultimately see?
I think the strength of it in general is having that flexibility of going either way.
Right.
Now, I think there's pros and cons to both. having him with Morgan Riley, there is some familiarity. They played together at the 2017 World Championships. When you look at the play styles of both of them, as you kind of pointed out, it works out, right? Riley likes to jump up. He's in the offensive zone. Tanev can play a role there. But obviously an offensive defensive defenseman, match made in heaven right away. Now, when we look at the cons of that, I would definitely say it comes down to ice time. Tanev really over the last couple years doesn't really get the minutes that you would usually see from a one or two defenseman. Last year in Dallas, he was kind of fourth in terms of just overall 5v5 minutes per game. So that will be a little bit of a jump for Tanev. Now, not to say he hasn't played those minutes in the past, but it has been a few years. Um, Other than that, it's just really the other con is even in the past few years, he's usually played on a shutdown pairing. And that kind of brings us to Jake McCabe. Last year, he was with SL Lendl. They were kind of a below 40% in terms of offensive zone starts. When he was in Calgary, he mostly played with Noah Hannafin in 2023. Sorry, in 2022, 2023. Has also played with Mackenzie Weegar a little bit and Oliver Shillington back in 2021, 2022. That's where he played a little bit higher, a little bit more offensive zone starts. So, I think ultimately we will see both of them come into play. I think the best route will kind of be having Tanev play maybe like 23, 24 minutes and getting a mix of both within a game. If it's a defensive zone start, end of the period, you need to stop, best players are on the ice, you want Tanev with McCabe. You also want Riley to have those offensive zone starts and to Tanev to sometimes be in there as well. So I think kind of mixing within the game is going to be kind of the best way to go about it. Really, if they pick one pair and keep it for the whole game, it really just depends on kind of the other right-handed or right defenseman options that the Leafs have. If you have a very healthy Yadi Hakanpää that can potentially play with Morgan Riley,
Yeah.
then I think there's a good option of having McCabe and Tanev when the playoffs start. But really just comes down to who can play with Riley if you have Tanev with McCabe.
Absolutely. And the fact that Chris Tanev has done a little bit of both. You mentioned him playing a little bit with Shillington, obviously the defensive pairing with Esa Lindell. You go back to the end of his Vancouver tenure, and he was that guy alongside a young Quinn Hughes as well. So
Mhm.
he's done a lot of kind of both in his career recently over the past 5, 6 years. So it's something where you would feel confident about him kind of playing with either guy. And I would imagine, like you mentioned, that we'll see a little bit of both. The other thing that I'm glad you mentioned is the ice time, where you hear the way Tanev has described, and you might expect him to be that 22, 23-minute guy. That's not really what he's been recently.
Mhm.
And especially last year, averaging under 20 minutes and in the playoffs being that kind of number 4 guy in terms of ice time with the Stars. You compare that to TJ Brody, he's essentially replacing in the lineup, obviously not in the playoff lineup, but in terms of being that guy alongside Morgan Riley, Brody was still playing nearly 22 minutes as recently as literally last season. That's a big difference between those two players. Do you think Tanev will be closer to what he was in Dallas, where he's getting that 19, 20 minutes, kind of managing him more, just given kind of the workload that he's taken on, and we might see some different mixing and matching of pairings? Or do you think we might see closer to the TJ Brody thing, where he's playing the 21, 22 minutes pretty consistently alongside somebody like Morgan Riley?
When I look at just roster construction in general, I do think he'll be kind of closer to the higher mark. Um, because obviously on that second pair, you've got McCabe, and whether that's going to be a Simon Benoit, maybe OEL will also go into that second pair at some point. I don't see them kind of creeping up too much. So I do expect Tanev to kind of be on the higher mark, especially when he's playing with Morgan Riley. Um, I would say there is a bit of mystery when it comes to obviously Berube. There's a new coach. Um, with Keefe, we had such a long kind of history of the way he likes his to kind of deploy his
Very
pairings.
different this training camp, right? Like we don't know
Exactly.
what to expect.
Exactly. Which is kind of nice, right? Like I think with Keefe, I know both you and I followed the Marlies very closely. It there was it was very rare that you kind of were surprised with what Keefe was going to be doing, and in a good
Yeah.
way. I mean, he was quite good at finding kind of strengths and weaknesses of his players and deploying them as such. I think that's probably one of his biggest strengths. With Berube, obviously, like me personally, I'm not too sure how he's going to deploy his defensemen, especially on a new team in a new organization with new players. So that part, I am pretty intrigued to see how Berube does it.
Yeah, and so I think at this point, I think it's probably best to get to the main talking point with Chris Tanev, and of course, that's the contract. The Leafs really coveted Tanev all the way back to the trade deadline. There was some weird stuff about Calgary, whether they would trade him to the Leafs or not, the first round pick stuff. All of that's in the rearview mirror. The main point is that the Leafs liked him enough to trade for his UFA rights and sign him to a 6 year contract with a $4.5 million cap hit, despite him being 34 years old. Just kind of straightforward question, and it's not necessarily a straightforward answer, but is that 6 year contract worth the risk considering his injury history, the wear and tear on the body, but also the elite defensive defenseman that you're getting? At least you expect so in year number one.
I think in a vacuum, yes. He's a very good player. It's very rare that a player that is right-handed that has his type of profile, kind of you can sign that player to a $4.5 million contract. So I do think overall it is the risk. It is worth the risk. It really just comes down to how you use that cap space over that time, right? The In terms of, you've saved a little bit of cap there to get the player. Now you have to use that cap. In terms of the term, that's kind of the game you have to play if you want to get that cap down. We know that the Leafs are in this win now situation. Every dollar counts. They're trying to build a very good roster over this next 4 to 5 years while Matthews is still signed. So I think it's worth it. We will see how it plays out. But really, it's just when it comes to players that are 30, 34, he's going to be 35 in December. The drop off, and we've seen this so many times. We've seen this with TJ Brody, we've seen this
Yep.
with Jake Muzzin. The drop off isn't usually gradual, it's usually very quick. The hope with him is that you kind of have a situation where it's Mark Giordano, right? Where someone who kind of plays into their kind of high 30s and then the drop off comes. Whereas when you look at Muzzin and Brody, I'm pretty sure Brody's younger than Tanev and
Yeah, that's
Muzzin's
a little
like
bit scary.
right. And I think Muzzin's like a year older, if I'm not mistaken. So really you hope that Tanev can keep going until like 37, 38, and then we see that drop. So really that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Giordano part there. I looked back at what Giordano was doing at the same age, and the first part of this is really exciting. Tanev is going into what is essentially his age 35 season since he turns 35 in December. That is the same age as what Giordano was when he had his Norris Trophy winning season.
Mhm.
That's very exciting. The not as exciting part is that Giordano would have been in the last season of that 6 year contract the Leafs just handed out at 40 years old this past season, making $4.5 million. That part of it is less exciting. Of course, Mark Giordano and Chris Tanev, two different players, two different skill sets. It's not going to be the exact same situation in terms of how they age. But what the accepted kind of situation is that, of course, at the end of that contract, you're going to be eating a little bit and hoping that the first kind of 2, 3, 4 years of that contract are going to be kind of the benefit of having that cheaper cap hit on the total. And talking
Right.
about that cap hit at $4.5 million, it was less than what I was definitely expecting when he was signing. Of course, the term being longer than I was expecting as well. You look at the other right shot defenseman that signed in around kind of Tanev's quality. Montour over 7 million, Matt Roy just under 6 million, Brett Pesce 5.5 million, less than 1 million more than Matt Dumba got on the open market. And of course,
Right.
the long-term contract that is going to be risky going into literally his early 40s is a big risk, and the big reason why the cap it is as cheap it is as it is. But for a team like the Maple Leafs, who are always nickel and diming right up against the cap, trying to figure out how to make the most of every kind of roster spot around the top dollar team players on the roster, having a Chris Tanev type who, as we've talked about time and time again, one of the legitimate elite defensemen in the game on the defensive side of the puck, which the Leafs so dearly need at only $4.5 million, can't be seen as anything but a win for at least this upcoming season. It really is kind of looking at everything around this roster, having $4.5 million Chris Tanev is really, really exciting. And again, the cliff can fall at any time. The risk is the long-term nature of it. But at the same time, for this Maple Leafs roster, you're not really looking for the long term. It's what can this roster do this season? What can this roster do in the next couple of seasons? And Chris Tanev at $4.5 million does nothing but significantly, in my opinion, help this team's odds come playoff time.
For sure. 100%. He's that playoff type player that, can does those things that limit shots on your own net, limit goals on your own net. I guess I don't even want to really touch on, there's been a lot of stuff about LTIR, and by the end
Yeah.
he might be LTIR.
It's such an unknown. Like
for
it's
sure,
tough to talk about that part of it, right? Yeah.
for sure. I think like the ideal situation with Tanev is that he stays kind of that elite defensive defenseman over the next 3-4 years. Obviously, for 6 years, that would be amazing, but I don't think that's real. I
Yeah.
don't think that's realistic. Let's say 3 to 4 years, and then after that, he kind of turns into a bit of a specialist. Maybe he's a 5-6 that takes on defensive zone starts, kind of like what Giordano
Yeah.
ish was, minus the zone starts, but kind of that bottom pair defenseman. Yes, you're paying him 4 to 5 mil, but in 5 to 6 years, the cap will go up. That 4.5 is looking like a 2.5, which you can kind of squint and look at, teams now. And, there are some 2.2 million, $2.5 million players that are playing bottom pair right now in that kind of defensive specialist role. So I think that's like best case scenario. That's somewhat realistic, I will say, barring any injuries. So I think that's what the Leafs will definitely be hoping for.
And we talk about Chris Tanev being that playoff type player, and his playoff run with the Stars this year, I don't think has got even enough attention as to how great it was. That pairing with Esa Lindell was one of the key reasons that the Stars went as far as they did in the playoffs. They outscored Jack Eichel's unit 3-1 in the first round. They outscored Nathan MacKinnon's unit 3-1 in the second round. And as great as Connor McDavid's playoff run was, losing your minutes 4-3 against Connor McDavid and just shy of 50 minutes is honestly a win, all things considered. It was an elite defensive performance from Chris Tanev in the playoffs, getting significant defensive zone starts as well, which also in turn helped the top pairing of Thomas Harley and Miro Heiskanen do great things in the offensive zone as well. We talk about the playoffs, and so much of the conversation around the Leafs is regular season doesn't matter, playoffs is all that matters, blah, blah, blah. You're adding one of the best defensive defensemen in literally this past playoffs that went to the conference finals, played against elite competition throughout the entire playoffs, and had very good results doing so to this roster. And you look at the path, no matter who it is for the Maple Leafs in the playoffs, you're going to be going up against elite talent in this division, in this conference. And adding somebody like Chris Tanev, who is coming off of such a good defensive run in the playoffs on a Stars team who he joined at the trade deadline. He wasn't even building on that over the course of the entire season. That is very, very exciting going into this upcoming season.
Yeah, 100%. And even to add on to how good he was in the playoffs, I mean, he started 65 faceoffs in the offensive zone and 190 in the defensive zone for 25%. And Dallas outscored their opponents 13-10, and expected goals was 54. And like that context, sometimes there's, when it comes to zone starts, it can be overblown, but a 51% expected goals for someone who has 30% offensive zone starts versus someone who has like a 60, it's a massive difference, especially when you're playing McKinnon and McDavid a lot of shifts, right? So just a really kind of memorable run that Tanev went on with Esa Lindell.
And so kind of as we begin to get to the end of the conversation here, the other element that I think kind of goes overlooked for Chris Tanev, we talk about the potential pairing with Morgan Rielly. That gets people excited. You talk about the playoff performance. That gets people excited. One of the key things that really dropped off last year for the Maple Leafs was the penalty kill.
Mm-hmm.
And lacking that kind of right shot option that could really kill penalties at kind of the top of the unit and help the unit clear the puck and eventually be just kind of a better unit overall. The absence of Justin Hall, for all of his faults, he was an absolute beast on the penalty kill as a right shot guy. And the Leafs just didn't really have anybody that stepped up into that role on the penalty kill last year. We've seen it time and time again. Feels like every single week last year at the end of the season, there was a different highlight of Chris Tanev laying out to block a shot with like his face and going down the tunnel and coming back later in the game. Obviously, you don't want that all the time, but Chris Tanev is an absolute warrior in kind of the way that we've seen Mark Giordano do it at times with this team. Being that right shot defenseman who can be that top end penalty killer is another just huge aspect added to this Maple Leafs roster who are desperately missing that in recent seasons. How big of a factor do you think his addition to the penalty kill will be this upcoming year?
I think it's massive, especially when you have, you look at the other teams in the division. I mean, you've got Kucherov and Tampa, which is a great power play. You've got Boston, which almost perennial every year they're a good power play, and then obviously Florida. We've seen kind of how the games are refed in the playoffs, where it's kind of, usually it's a power play for one team, then the other team, then one team, then the other team. So the amount, how you do on the power play, I mean, we've seen it year after year. The Leafs, in terms of just power play goal differential and their opponents, it's a pretty big difference. So not only have the Leafs need to improve their power play, but yeah, their penalty kill this past year was pretty atrocious. So I think Tanev being in the lineup is going to be massive for that. Just knowing how good the power plays are in the division, and obviously with this format, we're going to see either Boston, Florida, or Tampa most likely in the first round.
Yeah, it's an absolute gauntlet there when you look at those teams, and especially those power plays as well. Some of the elite power plays in the league, kind of across the board there, and it also helps in the regular season as well, which we've seen time and time again. The Leafs have been that 2 or 3 seed, and if you have a little bit of a better penalty kill and a guy that can help at 5-on-5 get the best out of your top units as well, that can push you towards potentially winning the division. And we've seen time and time again that top seed in whatever division it is getting that significantly easier first round series than the 2-3 seeds who seemingly every single year is a dogfight in every single division. Now, that's not always the case. We saw the Panthers go out in the first round against Boston. It's something that happens all the time. But if you're talking about giving yourself the easiest path to the second, third, and obviously eventually cup final, usually that goes through winning the division. And for all the talk about how good of a regular season team the Leafs have been, and for how kind of regular season dependent the Leafs have been versus the playoff success, the team has only won the division in the Matthews era in the COVID Canadian division year. Like if this team is competing at the top of the division and winning the division, that's a big difference in terms of those playoff differences as well. And you look at the the penalty kill in the playoffs, and it was like 65%. And Chris Tanev completely changes that complexion. And in a series that is seemingly always so tight for the Leafs in the first round, 1 or 2 goals here or there is such a massive difference for this team. And talking about him replacing TJ Brody in the regular season lineup, replacing the Joel Edmondson, Ilya Lyubushkin type in the playoffs, just every way you look at it, this is such a massive addition to this Leafs lineup for this upcoming season, if it is kind of risky, that long-term kind of way that it will likely pan out. And so as we wrap up here, I have one more for you, and it's kind of this projected over-under type thing. So much conversation is about the long-term nature of the Chris Tanev deal and how it will pan out, and goes back to kind of his injury history and not necessarily the last couple of years, but before that, not necessarily being able to play full seasons. We saw him last year play vast majority of the season. A couple years ago, play the full season with Calgary. Pretty simple, straightforward over under 69.5 games played for Chris Tanev this season. Do we see Chris Tanev play the majority full season for the Leafs this upcoming season?
I am always a Leafs fan first whenever I'm on on any podcast. So I will definitely be taking the over. And let's say it's like 70-71 and he misses 10 games at some point just for load management, so he's ready to go in the playoffs. So that'll be my answer.
Love it. And I'll just do one more actually, just here at the end. Like, looking at the additions the team has made over recent years, and this is a bit of a tough one, but just how significant of an addition is Chris Tanev to this roster? Like, if you look at the moves this team has made in kind of the past 4 or 5 seasons, how high does the Chris Tanev signing rank for you in terms of significant moves that this Maple Leafs team has made to add to this team? Obviously not including re-signings and kind of the big contracts that they've handed out to the players already on the roster. Where does this one kind of rank up for you? Not necessarily in like a 1, 2, 3 situation and have to go through every single move, but just kind of in, let's call it tiers. Is it in that top tier, top move, significant addition for you over the past handful of years with this Leafs team in terms of adding a player of this caliber to the roster?
I think in terms of the player he is today, yeah, it's in the top tier for sure. I do like that it's at 4.5 mil. It gives them flexibility at the rest of the roster to add. Um, Obviously, I would say it's probably kind of in the middle to the lower part of that tier because of the age. It does kind of put a lot of pressure on this year and the next two, let's say, years, which the pressure was going to be there anyways, given kind of the core's age. They're obviously not 21 anymore. So I would say it's kind of in the middle there. I think one big thing for me is that, I know the Leafs don't get a lot of credit for this, but kind of from the North Division season and then the two seasons after that, they were a pretty good defensive team.
Yes. Yes.
At 5-on-5, at suppressing shots, even, the goaltending wasn't always there, so it wasn't always showing up in goals against, but they were a very good defensive team. Their penalty kill was better. And I felt like last year they really got away from that. They kind of turned into, they did improve around the mid part of the season, but they kind of ended up being, a kind of middle of the pack defensive team at 5-on-5, really bad on the penalty kill. Now, at 5-on-5, they did have a very good series against Boston, so we have to give them credit there. But I think this is a push to get that defensive game a lot better. And we really haven't had a good shutdown defenseman, a really elite shutdown defenseman since Jake Muzzin got injured. So I think in itself makes this very, very valuable of an ad. So just for that itself, it turns into a top tier move. Now it's just about longevity and health when it comes to Tanev, to see kind of where that lands when all is said and done.
Absolutely. Nick, this has been an awesome conversation. I can't wait to see Chris Tanev on the ice. Like, this is such an exciting addition to this Maple Leafs team. And maybe it's a bit of the nerd coming out in us being excited
100%.
about a defenseman that's going to score like 15 points this season. But Nick, thanks so much for jumping on. This has been great. Let everybody know where we can find your work and plug the pod as well while you're at it.
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you so much, Kyle, for having me. I'm really excited to be tuning into this series as the season comes closer. But yeah, so you guys can find me at the Everything Leafs podcast, as well on Twitter at Nick DeSouza _. But yeah, thanks again for having me, Kyle.
Yeah, it's been fun doing all of these, and it's going to ramp up, of course, now with training camp and preseason. Quite literally here now. As we're recording this, we're 1 day away, one sleep away from training camp opening up, and getting into kind of all the NHL rostered players here over the next couple of weeks. It's going to be a lot of fun. Nick, thanks so much for jumping on. Enjoy the season. It's going to be a fun one.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kyle.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Camp Countdown. Thanks again to Nick for jumping on the show. That was a really fun chat all about Chris Tanev. Training camp is finally underway, getting some tidbits today about some Leafs injuries, some potential lineup combinations and such. We're going to have a lot of that over the coming weeks. And of course, Camp Countdown continues on right up until the start of the new season on October 9th. So be sure to tune in tomorrow for more Camp Countdown. I'll see you then.